Hello, my name is Kate Button, and this is my presentation of my honors thesis in the English department. My project is titled Car Fetishization in Hollywood Films, A Tragedy of the Commons, and my advisor for this thesis is Dr. Disa Gambara. My thesis explores how cars are represented in 5 mainstream Hollywood films and how typical representations of the car may contribute to a negative environmental impact. From the introduction of the automobile in American society at the beginning of the 20th century, the automobile has dominated and defined American culture. In 1908, Henry Ford invented the Model T car and forever altered America's relationship with the car. With Ford's invention, the car almost immediately became synonymous with American identity and culture. By the end of World War II, the car was a fundamental fact of life in America. Smooth roads across the country permitted easier, more reliable, and faster transportation by car. Overcrowded cities were eventually dispersed through a grand migration to the suburbs, and with both governmental incentives and a restructuring of American livelihoods, the car became an integral component of American life. As this dependence on the car was established and ever-growing, the American love affair with the car began to be represented in Hollywood films. In early car films, the car was modeled as a means to become attractive or desirable. The car could also symbolize freedom and liberty, or it could offer a sense of escape and refuge. In the union between film and car, the automobile is represented as a means to an emotional reward. The car itself is used as both a mechanism of transportation and a way to tie the male protagonist's identity to themes of independence and sexual prowess. These films are meant to entertain, and the cars are symbols of freedom, power, and attraction. Although the car is a popular means of transportation and one that is necessary given the political, cultural, and structural realities of American culture, my thesis instead focuses on the emotional and psychological dependency on the car in American life as presented in Hollywood films. There is a real dependency on cars in America based on simple needs for transportation, but simultaneously the car has been construed as a means to express American identity. There is an unconscious investment in the car that has nothing to do with transportation. Starting in the 1950s, Hollywood films tied the car to an ideal of American identity that is characterized by independence, freedom, glamour, power, and masculinity. However, this psychological and identity-based dependence on the car is combined with a real logistical and transportation-based dependence. Both the actual structure of society and the emotional significance of the car contribute to the very real tragedy that is the global climate crisis. While these two areas of life are significant contributors to the American love affair with the car, this paper will focus on how Hollywood films reveal a psychological dependence on cars that in turn contributes to a degradation of the natural world. In order to conduct this analysis of Hollywood films, the psychological dependence on cars that they present, and their deliberate choice to ignore the environmental damage that car films tacitly accept and even encourage, I will utilize 2 main theoretical frameworks: Karl Marx's theory of commodity fetishism and the tragedy of the commons as explained by William Forster Lloyd. Commodity fetishism, as originally proposed by Karl Marx, occurs when a given product or item appears to have an intrinsic value when in reality its associated value is created by social relations and connotations. Cars, for example, are associated with independence, freedom, and agency. In advertisements and movies, the car symbolizes liberation, yet the realities of the environmental costs and labor issues remain hidden. Cars are unique in that they do have a legitimate value as they provide a method of transportation, but this value is blown out of proportion as American culture and Hollywood films revere the automobile for the power and liberation that the car is fetishized to represent. Hollywood movies leave audiences with glamorized and stylized depictions of modern car culture, thus erasing their detrimental environmental consequences. According to William Forster Lloyd, in an environment with a finite supply of resources and very few regulations, individuals will act in whichever way serves their best interest, no matter what the environmental or collective consequences are. He deemed this phenomenon the tragedy of the commons because if each person in a community acts upon their own self-interest, then the environment, and humans too, will suffer extreme consequences. In the case of car culture, the car is a very real necessity for life in America, but when media and films simultaneously present the car as a pathway to expressing one's identity, the combination of these two factors exponentially increases individuals' tendencies to depend on the car in all aspects of their daily lives. With the combination of transportation-based and identity-based car dependencies, the number of cars on the road will continue to skyrocket and lead to increases in car crashes, time spent in traffic jams, and greater amounts of CO2 emissions. In the context of Hollywood films, as movies fetishize the car, pairing car ownership with independence, freedom, and other attractive qualities, the idea of owning a car appears to fulfill an individual's ego. Hollywood car movies function as a mode of advertising because they are inherently tied to associations with celebrity, glamour, and wealth. As these films capitalize upon the image of the car without depicting the environmental consequences, the car only evokes positive connotations. While there are plenty of Hollywood car films to analyze, my paper will focus on a select few made after 1985. In the late 1980s, the ozone hole was discovered, which prompted global recognition of environmental issues. The discovery of the ozone hole was a landmark revelation in terms of the climate crisis, so this paper will feature analyses of films that were made after this watershed year. This paper will incorporate analysis from films of a few different genres in order to examine car fetishization from a variety of perspectives. My thesis will be broken into two main sections. The first will examine masculinity and Marxism in Drive, Baby Driver, and Ford v. Ferrari, and the second will focus on femininity and environmental theories in regards to Clueless and La La Land. For the key subgenres of car films, the getaway driver film offers a view of the car that enables freedom, escape, and liberty. In both Drive and Baby Driver, the lead actors are tied to their automobiles in their lives of crime, but they also utilize the car as their hope for emancipation. Drive is a 2011 film from Nicholas Winding Refn. Drive focuses on an unnamed getaway driver. This character, only ever referred to as the driver, falls in love with his neighbor Irene, portrayed by Carey Mulligan, and begins to care for her son. On the outside, the driver seems to be a normal, quiet, unassuming neighbor. But just like the cars he drives, there is an incredible power to him, and he is capable of great feats of driving and violence. The parallel between the cars he drives and the driver's own personal identity reveals a layer of psychological dependence on the car. Not only is this dependence based in desires for control and power, but the car also serves as a reflection of the self. At one key moment, Drive does present the natural world in a scene of bucolic escape. The driver takes Irene and her son to the LA River, and although it looks unrealistically clean and vibrantly green, he is able to imagine an unattainable future with Irene. The brief affair between the driver and Irene revolves around the car, but their relationship is fully realized in this key scene, completely outside of the car. Psychologically and logistically, the driver is dependent on the car to realize his masculine identity. He acts as a provider and takes care of Irene and her son through his car ownership. Near the end of the film, the driver references the fable of the scorpion and the frog. Even though the scorpion needs the frog's help to cross the river, the scorpion's nature is to sting, killing both the frog and drowning the scorpion who cannot swim. This idea of mutual destruction, an echo of the tragedy of the commons, is seen as the driver attempts to return a bag of stolen money to the local mob boss. The driver ultimately follows what is in his nature. He drives away, but he has to leave the people that he loves. The final scene leaves the driver alone, removed from society, and entrapped within the car. In spite of his good intentions, the car and the crimes that it helped him commit deprive him of fulfilling his desire to be with Irene. In contrast to Drive, Baby Driver, a 2017 film from Edgar Wright, slightly retells the same story in a more mainstream view. Baby is forced into driving for Doc after stealing one of his cars without knowing the contents. Although Baby clearly wants out of this lifestyle, Doc pulls him back in again so that Baby can turn a profit. As Baby skillfully maneuvers each getaway, his prowess in driving is evident. Throughout the film, Baby is forced to continue to drive, but when he ultimately stands up for himself, he refuses to drive. Instead, he chooses to run away from police before hijacking several cars. Eventually, the police catch up with him and prevent him from driving away as he is stopped on a bridge. The scene offers the greatest amount of natural life in the movie. The bridge crosses a body of water and there are trees lining the frame. In this natural setting, Baby is given the chance to come clean and face the consequences of his past crimes. Once Baby is released from jail, he enters into a new relationship with the car. Rather than the car as a symbol of his servitude, it now represents his freedom and his union with his love interest, Deborah. As he is released, Deborah is there waiting for him with an incredibly expensive vintage car, ready to embark upon a cross-country road trip. The scene is so fantastical that it is hard to believe it is real. Whereas the driver must flee and cannot follow his dream to live with Irene, Baby is shown leaving prison to enter into a fantasy life with Deborah. Yet the fantasy removes the viewer's certainty that Baby will be able to get an early release from prison and be reunited with Deborah. Instead, the fantasy is presented as a dream of an ideal life, but it is one that may not be possible given the tragedies associated with the car in Baby Driver. Another key genre of car films is the car racing movie. Featuring stylized cars, a drive for innovation, and the need for speed, James Mangold's 2019 film Ford v Ferrari tells the story of the Ford Motor Company's desire to beat Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans race in France. The film looks back on the 1960s with nostalgia, and it makes us question how we got to the car culture that we see today. Ken Miles, a racer and struggling mechanic, is hired by his friend Carroll Shelby to help Ford design a race car to beat Ferrari. As a stand-in for American identity, the Ford company needs to win the Le Mans race in order to assert an American dominance, and the Ford executives want the Ford brand to be synonymous with victory in order to sell more cars to ordinary Americans. Miles has a vision of individuality and quality work, but his values are consistently repressed by the Ford executives to prioritize a vision of identical cars. As the three identical Ford cars cross the finish line at Le Mans, all focus is drawn away from Miles's labor, and instead the Ford company as a corporation receives all the credit. Shortly after Miles's unrecognized victory at Le Mans, he is killed while test driving the Ford race car in preparation for the next year's race. While the film seeks to recognize Miles's essential contribution to Ford's success in auto racing, it also suggests that his efforts were ultimately forgotten by a corporation more focused on mass production than individual effort. The film's setting in the 60s is so focused on nostalgia that it ignores the air pollution from cars that was already present throughout the LA basin. Such erasure undermines the film's emphasis on Miles and Shelby's individual efforts to produce a unique race car for the Ford Motor Company. Drive, Baby Driver, and Ford v Ferrari, I found that the car is presented as both a source of pleasure and pain for the three male protagonists. All three male drivers are imprisoned to different extents within the car, but throughout each film, the drivers are reliant upon the automobile as their primary source of work and identity. The car is tied up in their psychology, and it is impossible to sever the car from their identities. In the next section, I will discuss two main films, Clueless and La La Land. Both of these films introduce main female characters who are also linked to cars and utilize the car as a means to claim greater gender equality. However, both female protagonists present a more ambivalent relationship to cars as status symbols, and their attitudes offer insights into ways Hollywood films could turn away from relying on cars as fundamental for masculine identity as well. whereas the male-driven films featured characters who are completely enmeshed in car culture, where male drivers are either cut off from those they love or killed in a car crash. These female-driven films instead offer a sense of hope for the future of the environment through their ability to distance themselves from driving as a source of identity. Amy Heckerling's 1995 film Clueless is a modern retelling of Jane Austen's novel Emma. In the film, Cher Horowitz is a self-absorbed teen who is frequently found driving around or spending time at the mall. Clueless opens on a few scenes of teens driving and shopping. As Cher drives, she runs into planters in people's yards, she fails to stop at stop signs, and she often wavers in between lanes on the road. In these first few scenes, we can see that Cher's driving patterns are steeped in a blatant disregard for the world around her. Cher makes driving decisions that are reflective of a selfish perspective, and little to no concern is given for the surrounding environment. When Cher ultimately fails her driving test, she suffers an unexpected blow to her ego. But it is this moment that sparks Cher's environmental awareness campaign. She realizes her previous actions were entirely self-motivated, so as she helps others, she learns how to shift her motivations towards benefiting the greater world around her. After the failed driving test, Cher is never seen in a car again. Cher is denied automobility and denied access to the male-dominated world of cars. But even though she can't express her autonomy in this arena, she still succeeds in forming her own identity based in a concern for the planet and humankind. Also set in Southern California, Damien Chazelle's 2016 film La La Land presents the lives of struggling actors and musicians in Los Angeles, a traffic-filled city that is impossible to navigate by public transit. The opening scene features a classic Los Angeles traffic jam. Rather than demonstrate the agony of being stuck in traffic or the pollution released, the traffic jam is romanticized and appears fun and desirable as the situation leads into the first musical number. While everyday experiences of traffic are frustrating, the scene evokes the hope and glamour associated with the dream seekers that populate Los Angeles. These characters are all bound to their cars in the search of a better life, and although the scene does appear to glamorize sitting in traffic, there's also a sad tone in just how isolated everyone has become in their own individualized cars. Later at a party, Mia asks Sebastian to retrieve her keys from the valet, and nearly all of the attendees at the party have keys to the same type of car, the Toyota Prius. The scene is comical, but it suggests an individualized movement towards owning cars that are hybrid or electric and more environmentally conscious. While the realities of life in Los Angeles require car ownership, the fact that the film decides to show this consumer choice of an eco-conscious car is significant. There has been some gradual movement towards environmental awareness in society, but when Hollywood decides to put these choices into a movie, it suggests that it sees cars as representing a different form of car-based identity in its characters. At several key points in Mia and Sebastian's relationship, they look out over the LA Valley, and Mia often remarks that the view of the valley is not much to look at. She's seen better, or it is frankly an awful view. While the images of the valley that the audience sees are pristine images, these comments reflect what residents of LA might say when looking out over a polluted valley. La La Land does not film the air pollution present in Los Angeles, but these comments reflect the wide-scale awareness of the quality of air they breathe and the proliferation of air pollution that is present in LA, part of which is due to the hours spent in traffic that many LA residents encounter. While the smog is not depicted and there is a visual erasure of the environmental damage that cars create, these remarks offer a slight move towards a verbal acknowledgement of the climate crisis, a key step towards realizing the interplay between cars and the environment. Through the case studies of Drive, Baby Driver, Ford v Ferrari, Clueless, and La La Land, we can see different ways that car culture is presented or critiqued in Hollywood films. To different extents, the car is fetishized in all of these films, but there are also anxieties about the car and the environment in these films that are critical to note. Currently, car culture in America is in a point of transition as the realities of the climate crisis become ever present. But film is still catching up with this movement. In these films, the car may offer a source of freedom or pleasure, but the car can also imprison, destroy, and pollute. Moving forward, film could help inspire this movement to sever the car from American identity by refusing to continue glamorizing car culture. But until then, it is essential to mark the interplay between film and cultural behavior. Hollywood films must also rethink how the car is presented and what the car means in our sources of entertainment. Thank you.